Every empire believes its wealth will last forever, but history keeps proving the opposite. Even enormous fortunes, even mountains of gold, can disappear far faster than anyone expects. In 1917, as the Russian Empire collapsed under the pressure of war, revolution, and betrayal, one of the largest gold reserves in the world effectively vanished. In today's terms, we are talking about billions gone into the chaos of history. Some believe it helped finance the Bolsheviks. Others think foreign powers took part of it. And then there are the stories that some of it was scattered across Siberia and never recovered at all. If you enjoy stories about money, power, and the hidden mechanics of history, subscribe to the channel and like the video, because this is not just a story about lost gold. It is a story about what happens when an empire loses the thing that made its money believable in the first place. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia held one of the largest gold reserves on Earth. By 1914, just before the First World War, the Russian Empire had more than 1,200 metric tons of gold. At the time, that mattered enormously, because gold was not just a symbol of wealth, it was the foundation of the financial system itself. Currencies were tied to gold, and the Russian ruble drew credibility from that enormous reserve. For ordinary people, that meant stability, at least in theory. The government could borrow, fund armies, buy imports, and maintain confidence because the world believed there was real metal behind the paper. But war destroys financial illusions very quickly. When the First World War began in 1914, Russia mobilized millions of men and poured huge amounts of money into the conflict. The costs were enormous. Weapons, ammunition, artillery, transport, railways, imported goods, everything had to be paid for, and much of it required hard currency. So gold began to leave. Russia used reserves to pay creditors, allies, and suppliers. At the same time, the government started printing far more paper money than its reserves could actually support. And predictably, inflation followed. The ruble, which had once looked solid, started to weaken. Prices rose. Food became more expensive. Wages failed to keep up. For peasants and urban workers, daily life became harder and harder. By 1917, the empire was cracking apart. Soldiers mutinied. Workers went on strike. Bread riots broke out. The February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government took over, but it was weak, divided, and unstable. And in the middle of all of this, one question became urgent. What was going to happen to the gold? Some of it was moved east, away from Petrograd and away from the front. Trains carrying bullion were sent into Siberia, guarded by soldiers whose loyalties were becoming less certain by the day. Some of it was sent abroad to places like London, Paris, and even Japan as collateral for loans. And some of it simply vanished into the confusion of revolution. When the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, they inherited only part of what had once been one of the largest gold reserves in the world. And this is where the story becomes even darker. The Bolsheviks used what remained to survive. Lenin and Trotsky understood something very clearly. Ideology alone does not buy weapons, food, coal, or ammunition. Hard assets do. So they sold gold abroad, used it in trade deals, and exchanged it for supplies. But intelligence reports from that period suggest the amount they controlled was far smaller than what Russia had held only a few years earlier. Somewhere along the way, hundreds of tons had disappeared. A portion likely ended up in the hands of anti-Bolshevik forces during the Russian Civil War. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak, one of the main white leaders, came into control of a huge stockpile of gold that had been moved east. At one point, he may have controlled more than 500 metric tons. But when the Bolsheviks eventually defeated him, much of that gold was gone too. Some had likely been stolen by corrupt officials. Some may have been used to pay for weapons. Some may have been smuggled abroad. Some may simply have been looted. And then, there are the legends. Stories of trains carrying crates of Russian gold deep into Siberia, never to be seen again. Stories of shipments disappearing near frozen lakes. Stories of gold being hidden, stolen, traded, or sunk. Whether every detail is true is hard to prove, but the larger reality is undeniable. One of the greatest gold reserves in the world was broken apart by war, revolution, and opportunism. Foreign powers were part of the story too. Britain, France, Japan, and others were involved in Russia during the Civil War, and rumors spread that some gold shipments were quietly seized or redirected under the excuse of protecting loans or strategic interests. The United States was also accused in some accounts of benefiting from Russian bullion moving through international channels. Hard proof is incomplete, but the pattern is familiar. When a system collapses, outside powers rarely stand back and do nothing. By the early 1920s, the gold mountain that had once supported the Russian Empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. And for ordinary Russians, the result was devastating. Without real reserves behind the currency, the ruble collapsed. Inflation became extreme. By 1921, money had lost so much value that people often had to rely on barter. Bread, clothing, labor, food, anything useful became more reliable than paper currency. Russia had not only lost a monarchy and a political order, it had lost financial trust itself. And that is what makes this story so important. Because Russia's crisis was not unique. It follows the same pattern we see again and again in history. The Roman Empire diluted its coins. Weimar Germany printed its money into worthlessness. Russia lost the gold that had anchored its system. Different methods, same result. Trust in money disappears. Society begins to unravel. Ordinary people suffer the most. And those with power, information, or connections usually find ways to protect themselves or profit from the collapse. As the Civil War continued, the missing gold took on an almost mythical status. People told stories of lost trains, hidden reserves, secret deals, and stolen shipments. Some of these stories were surely exaggerated, but they reflected a real truth. In times of collapse, wealth becomes prey. Everyone fights over it. Governments, armies, bankers, smugglers, foreign states, all of them. For the Bolsheviks, the remaining gold became the oxygen of the revolution. They sold it abroad through intermediaries in places like Sweden and Germany. Some of the gold that had once backed the Tsarist ruble was melted down, recast, and absorbed into international markets. The wealth of one regime was literally used to finance the birth of another. And while the Bolsheviks used gold to survive, others used the chaos to profit. Western banks, traders, and governments were often willing to buy Russian gold at steep discounts, even when its origins were unclear. For them, it was opportunity. And again, this is not unique to Russia. Whenever a system breaks, there are always people waiting to profit from the wreckage. By the mid-1920s, Soviet Russia had regained control over only a small portion of what had once existed. Out of more than 1,200 metric tons before the war, estimates suggest that fewer than 300 remained under Bolshevik control. The rest had been spent, stolen, traded, moved, looted, or lost. What remained for the Russian people was a damaged economy, a shattered currency, and a new regime that had learned a brutal lesson very quickly. Control over money is control over survival. And that brings us to the present. Why should a vanished reserve of Russian gold from more than a century ago still matter? Because the underlying mechanics have not changed. Governments still depend on reserves to support trust. Central banks still hold gold as a strategic asset. Nations under pressure still understand that when confidence in paper money weakens, gold becomes politically important again. And we still see reserves being weaponized. Today, foreign reserves can be frozen, blocked, or seized through financial systems rather than armies. Sanctions can do what invasions once did. Money is not just an economic tool. It is a political weapon. And once again, ordinary people usually pay the highest price through inflation, shortages, instability, and declining living standards. There is another lesson here too. Wealth built on trust can disappear much faster than most people imagine. The Russian Empire believed its gold made it secure, but war and revolution proved that even enormous reserves are not untouchable. And in our own time, many people assume their savings are safe simply because they sit in banks, pensions, accounts, or markets. But if those savings are tied to paper systems, then ultimately they are tied to trust. Trust in governments. Trust in institutions. Trust in central banks. Trust in systems that history has shown can fail. So, the disappearance of Russia's gold is not just an old mystery about lost trains and secret shipments. It is a warning. A warning that wealth can evaporate faster than empires expect. A warning that reserves do not save a system when trust is already dying. And a warning that in every serious crisis, the public is told to stay calm while the real transfer of wealth happens quietly in the background. That is the part history keeps repeating. Not just collapse, but who gets protected during collapse and who gets sacrificed. So, when you hear today about gold reserves, frozen assets, sanctions, emergency money creation, or central banks promising stability, remember this. Russia once had one of the largest gold stockpiles on Earth, and even that was not enough to save it. Because in the end, the real foundation of any monetary system is not gold alone. It is trust. And once trust breaks, even an empire full of treasure can come apart faster than anyone wants to believe.